Welcome back, folks, to another episode of our new podcast going on here. It is this time with Ellen Shapiro. She works for a wonderful GraphQL company. I'm sure I'll tell you more about that shortly. But this time, our hope is to talk about some GraphQL, some testing, some SPM, and of course, some of life's anxieties. There's all sorts going on this time. As always, I encourage folks to ask questions. I have a load of questions I want to ask Ellen. I hope you have your own questions as well. By all means, ask her in that chat box. I'll make sure she answers them fully. And again, thank you so much for Instabug for sponsoring my site. They have a wonderful toolkit where with just one line of code, it can help you identify bugs and solve those bugs really, really quickly. That's the intro out of the way. Let's get on to Ellen. How are you doing, Ellen?
I'm okay. How are you doing?
Everyone in the whole world is stressed out, so I'm as good as I possibly can
it's
be.
really, this has been a rough couple of weeks. It's, we were just in San Francisco like 3 weeks ago, basically the week before everything went completely sideways. And when we came back, Lilia, my fiance, had something that had like flu-like symptoms, but wasn't the flu. And they were like, and they tested her for COVID, and luckily she didn't have it. But they were like, well, it's not the flu and it's not COVID, but we don't want whatever you have floating around. So can you please self-isolate for 14 days? So it was like, yay. So this is now our third week of quarantine. So that's fun.
It's the wrong time to get ill right now. Let's face it. Of all the times to get ill, now is not the time.
Yeah, it's if you want to catch literally anything, now is really not the time. It was funny. There was a tweet going around where there was a hand surgeon who was like, hey, everyone who's thinking about doing all of these DIY projects that you were thinking about involving power tools, maybe not right now. Maybe like wait a few months until the hospitals are completely packed with people, and then do things that might severely injure your hand, and I will fix them. But
fair enough. So right now, folks in our position are still trying to get the actual job done. You know, we're at home, self-isolating or even quarantined, but we still have to do an actual job.
Yes, and that's been, I have to admit, that's been really, really difficult for me. I sort of, beyond the general anxiety that sent me sort of curling into a ball a lot of the time, we were planning to get married in June. That has now been postponed until next year, and that process was super fun. Pro tip, if you ever want to not lose a bunch of money, don't postpone a wedding. But it's definitely the right decision, and we're very, in terms of like things that could be going wrong right now. One of my colleagues, his wife is pregnant and due in a month. You can't just like be like, hey kid, can you come back next year? With that, and it's like, okay, at least with the wedding we can be like, all right, like wash our hands of it. Let's try this again next year. But yeah, like between generalized anxiety and then just dealing with the nonsense involved in that, I have been very unproductive, and I think I wanted to try to sort of normalize that, because I think there's a lot of stuff going around where people are like, oh yeah, like during the plague, Isaac Newton discovered gravity, or like all these people who were like, all these people who had to like, be isolated for all these reasons, they came up with all this great stuff. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure most of the other scientists besides Isaac Newton were just trying not to get the plague. And so, it's one of those things where I think there is some sort of like, my fiance is an academic, and there's this thing where people are like, oh man, if you don't have kids, you're going to be able to like write so many papers and do all this stuff. And my fiance is like, are you guys out of your minds? What are you talking about? And it's just, I think the idea that we're all supposed to be just as productive as we would normally be is a farce. And I think that, obviously for parents, it's much, much harder because, hello, this is George Michael. This is, I figured he would be making at least one appearance. Every time I do a meeting at work, he's like, oh, you've stopped typing? You can use your hands for pets now. So I figured he'd be joining me at some point. But anyway, I think it is something where, I think one of the things that's been really nice about the place that I work, which is a company called Apollo GraphQL, they've been really sort of great about like, hey, we're all kind of going through it right now. Like, we are all having a hard time, and it's okay to say, I'm having a really, really, really bad day. I need to just curl up into a fetal position for like several hours, and then I'll get back to attempting to work.
Yes.
And I think more and more employers are sort of realizing that that's the case. But it's definitely something where I think there is some level of compassion. Georgie, he's like, I want to play with the mouse. I'm like, no, not the real mice, not the trackpad.
Yeah. So speaking of GraphQL, it's one of those things that many developers in our position are aware of. Like, we know what GraphQL is conceptually, maybe, but you're obviously at the very cutting edge of it now. You're working at the folks who are shipping GraphQL stuff out to the world, right?
Yeah, and I think it's something where, I think a lot of iOS developers have heard of GraphQL and are like, that's a thing, right?
Yeah, we've heard the words GraphQL before.
Yeah, and it's like it's definitely one of those things where it's like, ooh, it's a buzzword. I think on front end the technology is a lot more mature, just because so Apollo as a company actually used to be called Meteor.js. And they actually had a big JavaScript framework. And when Facebook open sourced GraphQL, they had been looking for something to help manage sort of interacting with your data better. And they sort of said, okay, this really looks like an excellent candidate. And they started working on an open source implementation of it immediately, and have basically become the leaders in this for both server and client. Client in particular, and there's like huge depths of knowledge about this on web, where some of the problems are a little bit different than they are on mobile. I think on mobile, for me, the biggest thing that drew me to GraphQL was sort of the idea that, okay, anytime I make a REST request, I get back a pre-specified amount of data that says, okay, I asked for a user. So now I get back the user's username, date of birth, their address, their billing address, their shipping addresses. And like, for whatever I'm displaying, how much of that do I actually need at any one time?
Right.
And the idea with GraphQL is to sort of specify, basically there's a thing called a schema that is produced by whoever's managing the graph, which is usually sort of some combination of everyone, but is usually like manually managed by the server-side team. And they the schema is basically the thing that says, here are all of the things that you can possibly ask for or make changes on. And you can look at that schema, and then you can create these things called queries. And you can say, okay, you said that here's a user, and here are all of the possible properties that I can ask for on a user. Yeah. Give me these two. And then you will only get those two properties back for a user. And that's something where, both from a standpoint of efficiency in terms of like not overfetching data, and from a standpoint of sort of flexibility, I'll get back to that in a minute, I really felt like this was something that would work really nicely with mobile. And I think my recollection is that Facebook sort of originally started working with GraphQL to solve some of these problems on mobile. Well,
presumably, when we know we have a shaky connection, 3G back then, also even 4G today in most parts of the world sometimes, you don't want to have lots of data coming through because it's just wasteful.
Yeah, and it's definitely something where people are on limited data plans. You don't really want to you don't really want to push people's data plans, particularly in developing countries. I was in Laos in January, and I had like Edge the entire time I was there.
Right, and there's bad, right?
Yeah, and it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be, but it's definitely something where if you only need to display a couple of pieces of information, getting way more information than that is just going to make your calls unbelievably slow. And so it makes it much, much better to sort of say, okay, only give me back the pieces that I need.
Yeah.
And I find the biggest advantage to be flexibility at development time, because I think a lot of developers have run into the problem where they have this sort of REST endpoint that they're hitting for a particular screen. And a designer is like, hey, why don't we display this additional piece of information on that screen? And you go, well, that piece of information is not actually part of the REST endpoint that we have.
Right.
I would need to go to the backend team, ask them to add that to the REST endpoint that we already have. They have to go through an entire bunch of changes in order to make that happen. And then basically that winds up taking about a month, because they're like, okay, well, we need to do one sprint to build it, and then one sprint to test it, and then we'll deploy it. And then you can actually start programming this design change that your designer wanted. And like, meanwhile, they're on to something like 4 miles down the road.
Okay.
And I think the nice thing about GraphQL is it just sort of gives everybody a list of what is possible. And if it's in the list of what's possible, then it's possible. And if it's not in the list of what's possible, then it's either not, or you should talk about adding it. And
right.
It's something where, it makes that change much faster. So you just change the query to get back that additional field, and then you can iterate on that design so much faster. I think it's something where, there's some stuff that does become more tightly coupled, but I think one thing that it decouples that I found to be really, really useful is communication between backend and mobile in a way where you can get the data in the shape that you want it to be in.
Right.
And it just makes your life a lot easier when you need to make changes.
Okay, we've got a question here from Renato Silva, because a lot of folks have used or heard of GraphQL but haven't used GraphQL. There's a question here from Renato saying, is GraphQL only the query language, or does it refer to an actual database?
So it's the query language is GraphQL. So you can actually hook GraphQL up to any type of database. Like Apollo server is designed to be able to talk to any number of different kind of databases.
Right.
And that's part of why they actually started doing it in the first place, is because I think they were really heavily tied to one particular type of database, and they were like, well, that's silly. And so they were like, let's use a thing that can talk to any database.
Yes. And another folk up here, so look, we had someone saying, yes, you should look into this one perhaps. Sergio AI, Al, said, I went through Apollo tutorial and it seemed really great, awesome. However, I think we need some more practical examples. So perhaps you give it a practical example of where this stuff really shines.
I mean, I think the example that I was just talking about in terms of like having a designer who wants to do changes, or having some kind of change that needs to happen to the UI while the underlying data structure doesn't change at all. That's something that GraphQL really excels at, is like being able to say, hey, we've made new stuff available really, really easily.
Yeah.
And be able to say, okay, all you have to do is just add this particular thing to your query or your mutation. So mutations are basically like a type of query where you can tell the backend to make changes.
Okay.
So you can basically say, okay, now I want to start using this thing, and you can start using it basically immediately.
Okay, so we've got flexibility, stacks of that, because you can request more changes, but it's very clear what's actually there and what you want to request and so forth. Plus efficiency, you get only the bits you actually care about. And those two seem to be the real two killer features of GraphQL. Are there any more you're thinking about?
I mean, I think the big one on iOS, and the one that I spend most of my day working on right now, is code generation. So because you have the schema that defines sort of everything that you can ask for and the type it will be, and then you have this query where you can validate it against the schema and sort of say, okay, like, hey, schema, I want to ask for all of these things. Is that possible? And if you are able to say, okay, like, I know that I'm asking for these things, and I know that you're going to give me these things back, that means we can generate code that will do all of the parsing for you, do a bunch of stuff in terms of caching,
right?
Basically, like, give you a large chunk of a network layer without you really having to do anything.
And that's where you come in.
That's where I have a job. And yeah, so right now, so basically when Apollo for iOS was originally released, it was made by a guy named Martijn Walraven, and Martijn is an absolutely amazing programmer and was really super enthusiastic about Swift, but he also got pulled off onto other projects, and unfortunately, some of the design choices that he went with made it a little bit harder for people who were more traditional iOS developers to work with it, because he made some choices that were sort of based on the fact that he's a much stronger JavaScript developer than he is a Swift developer. And so there's a bunch of stuff that happened there. There's also just a lot of bit rot, because there was a long period of time where there really wasn't anybody maintaining it. Right. And so my job has been to come in, really try to update everything, try to fix as many of the small bugs as I can. And that's sort of, I've got through that part. Now I'm at the point where I'm like, okay, I have identified where all the structural problems are, and here's my sledgehammer. And
But that part is the bit you do for Apollo. But the other two, flexibility and efficiency, that's a general GraphQL benefit everyone can get from GraphQL.
Yeah, and that's definitely true. I think it's definitely something where, like, this is why GraphQL is getting popular, is because people are seeing these advantages. I think Apollo in particular is popular because we provide this code generation that allows you to essentially, like, skip 47 steps of getting all of this set up. And it's definitely not as straightforward as I'd like it to be, but it's a lot easier than writing it yourself.
Well, that's quite a topical question, actually, because Sergio AI is back again with another question here. Yeah. Is there anything Apple developers can do that will make integrating GraphQL easier? Because certainly in the past, we are not fearful, but reticent, hesitant to use technologies that Apple aren't, like, explicitly endorsing, like, almost built into Xcode and kind of endorsing. Yeah. And GraphQL currently is not one of those things, and so perhaps that's inhibiting us slightly. So what would make it easier for Apple developers to make integrating GraphQL easier?
I mean, honestly, I think a lot of the stuff that would make integrating GraphQL easier is stuff that applies much more broadly to code generation. I think a lot of the stuff that makes this setup a lot more annoying is basically the absence of Xcode plugins. There's Xcode extensions, which have a very, very limited amount that they can do. Yeah. I wrote back in the day, I wrote an extension for Xcode called Xcode Auto Basher, where you could basically say, okay, watch this directory or watch this file. Anytime it changes, run this script. And so it was nice because I could use that to, like, automatically regenerate all of my model objects when I had changed the core data model, or automatically regenerate this file that had type safe accesses to everything in my asset catalog whenever I put something new in the asset catalog or took something out of the asset catalog. And that's sort of something where, like, the fact that that's not super easy to do in iOS without having to do run script build phases and having to do some other weird nonsense, that's really a huge thing that is annoying. I think from a standpoint of general GraphQL, like, one thing to remember is that this is ultimately something where you are sending a bunch of JSON to the server, and the server is sending you a bunch of JSON back. And there's potentially other implementations where you could use other formats, but for right now, the overwhelming majority of GraphQL implementations are using JSON. And I think it's something where if you can remember that, ultimately that's what you're doing. It's much more about sort of trying to wrap your head around, like, okay, like, what are the places that I need to ask for what? And then particularly once you get into using a library, how is the caching working on this kind of thing? Because like it's very different from sort of just being able to shove everything into a database the way that you can from a REST endpoint where you know exactly what you're getting back. You can't say, okay, I'm going to make a user object that has the following, like it has a required ID, it's got a required username, it's got a required address. Well, the ID can be required, but if you didn't ask for it, you're not going to get it. So you can just say, hey, I want username, and that's the only thing it'll give you back. And so you can't just sort of shove that into a database that says, hey, your ID and your address are required, because then the database is like, hey, these required objects aren't here. And so there's a lot of stuff around that that's really confusing for people, and like I completely understand why. Like there's a lot of stuff about about how you have to work to cache that kind of thing that's extremely complicated. But it's definitely something where starting with understanding sort of what's the idea here, what is the problem that we're trying to solve, and then going from there, I think is a big thing. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, yes. Sticking with the Apple connection just one bit longer here, we have a question from Prathamesh who asks, is it possible to wrap an existing core data stack in a GraphQL wrapper? Would you?
I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. It's definitely something where you can do that, but there's a certain point at which you're giving up some flexibility by doing that, because it means that if you have fields that are required, if you have properties that are required, you have to ask for them every single time. And that sort of defeats the point of not overfetching. And so that's something where sort of either you have to make everything optional, which leads to other weird circumstances, or you have to sort of look at a different way of thinking about some of this stuff.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah. So let's assume someone already has a working app that is not using GraphQL right now. It's using regular REST calls. Brad asks, can you speak up to how big of a lift it is to get server from REST to GraphQL, to move from what you have right now to a full GraphQL stack?
I think that's a really interesting question. And I think one of the big questions is, how well is REST working for you right now? Are you working on a project where basically your APIs haven't changed in like 5 years and aren't going to? At that point, you might as well just keep using REST. There's a point at which one of the big advantages of GraphQL is its flexibility. But if you have data that you don't need to be flexible, REST is going to be much easier to use. And so that's something where, I think one of the things that I've been focusing on, we have a spec for multi-part form uploads in GraphQL, but it's something that is a little bit cumbersome to use, and it's a little bit weird to generate code for. And honestly, like 9 times out of 10, the easier way to do it is to use just a REST post to upload stuff to like an S3 bucket, get back the URL of whatever you uploaded it to, and then just send that as a string to GraphQL. Because sending it as a string to GraphQL is much more what GraphQL is actually meant to handle. And the sort of upload stuff is a little bit, I don't want to say stapled on, but it's not sort of the primary goal of what GraphQL is doing. And so it's something where we want to be able to provide support for it, but we also want to sort of say, hey, realistically, this is really something that we encourage people to seek out sort of what is the appropriate way of doing each individual thing. Because I think it is something where nothing is a panacea. Nothing. Like nobody in any amount of technology will ever say, my thing solves every problem. I will say, I think GraphQL solves a lot of problems. It can cause other problems. And I think that's something that whenever you're looking at a new technology, you have to be realistic about what the trade-offs you're making are. And I think, for me, there's a couple of places where GraphQL is really, really nice. One is if you have a really giant company where getting anything changed is a hideous pain, and you just need to be able to say, what is the underlying data here, and then I can do what I need to with that data. That's really helpful to be able to have a graph that you can query rather than having to query like 7 different endpoints to get the information for one screen.
Yeah.
The other place that's really nice is in a fast-moving startup where you have stuff that's changing all the time. Maybe you've decided to pivot from travel to recruiting, which is literally an email that I got from a company the other day.
I got the same one.
But it's definitely something where, and right now that seems like a pretty smart pivot. But,
yeah.
It's definitely one of those things where, if you have a decent amount of stuff that's like growing and not necessarily stable, and like you don't necessarily want to lock yourself into one structure.
Yes.
GraphQL is a really, really, really good choice. I think it is something where if you have something that is locked into a long-term structure and has been locked in and like basically isn't going to change, that might not be as good a choice for GraphQL. The other thing is that you can also mix and match. Like we definitely have people working with Apollo who they have some portion of their API that's sort of essentially old and ossified, and they're like, don't touch anything, it's going to collapse completely. And they don't want to start looking at moving that stuff to GraphQL because, frankly, it's going to be a mess.
No, you don't want that.
But and so, there's stuff where you can sort of, say, okay, for these pieces that aren't going to change, we can still use REST. But for these pieces that are new and are evolving, we can use GraphQL for those pieces. And I think it's important to remember that it's not a completely A/B choice, and I think a lot of people feel like it has to be.
Yes.
There's definitely a lot of advantages from going hey, a large amount of our stuff is in GraphQL, but I think one way a lot of people get started with GraphQL is having one service where they've had these kinds of problems migrate to GraphQL, rather than sort of having everything go to GraphQL at once, and seeing okay, are we actually seeing these advantages that are being touted? Are they worth the changes that we're doing? And, I think it is something where another place where REST can be really helpful is if you have a really performance critical call where you're just making this call over and over and over and over again. And if you're not careful, it could potentially have an enormous impact on your database. That's something where if it's absolutely performance critical, where it's just every millisecond counts, the more work that you can do on the server than the less work that you have to do on the device, then that's a place where sometimes REST calls make more sense. And it's definitely something where, it's something where you're looking at the trade-offs. What are you able to get out of GraphQL versus what are you able to get out of REST? And, I think for a lot of people, it's always worth looking at those seriously, because there is a point where where the new hotness is not necessarily what you actually need.
No.
But personally, what I see is that there are really big advantages to GraphQL at sort of the very big company scale, especially, and the very small company scale, especially. I think there are places in the middle where people can use it sort of for particular services in a way that could be really helpful.
So it's pragmatic. Well, I'll take one more GraphQL question here before we move on to the next topic. Go Fudge Yourselves asks, and this is you mentioned Panacea. They ask, can I write a GraphQL backend in Swift? Or which language would you recommend for backend in GraphQL? I guess if not Swift.
So I know that a lot of the stuff that we sort of use for examples is in Node. If you go to the Apollo website, there's a full stack tutorial that's using Node.js. I know that there's a plugin for Vapor that someone's working on for GraphQL. And I'm mad that somebody beat me to it, but but I'm glad that they're doing it and not me. So it's definitely something where there's work going on around GraphQL. I know that there's definitely some stuff in Ruby. There's a bunch of stuff in Kotlin, which will also work with the Java universe. I think there's a lot of options if you're looking at backends that are compatible with GraphQL. I think the front end choices are somewhat more limited, and that's where Apollo has sort of kind of become a little bit of a hegemony on some of it. But there's definitely other options, and I think there are instances where the way that our stuff is architected is somewhat opinionated, and if you don't share that opinion, that's fine. That's totally fine. I think my position is that the more that GraphQL can grow in general, I think the better that is for Apollo and every company working on GraphQL. So, I think getting people interested in sort of what are the basics of it and what are the benefits of it is really important to me.
Okay, so let's go ahead and just park GraphQL and think more about testing. Another area I know you are extraordinarily excited about. Because I remember having dinner with a bunch of speakers from the iOS community in London, I think last year, and we were going through, like, for a given topic, who would we think of first for that topic? And it was things like, for architecture, it would be Dave Long. For accessibility, it would be Sally Shepard or some of Panage or somebody. And then it came to testing, and it was Ellen. It was you straight away, which is great.
That's very nice.
That's your testing brand name, you see.
I would have said John Reed, but who's a wonderful advocate for test-driven development. I don't do test-driven development for many reasons, but I think he really nails what the advantages are of it. And I think, he's definitely someone I would recommend. If you're interested in testing at all, you should follow him as well.
John
that's
Reed,
very nice of
qualitycoding.org, folks. John Reed is amazing. He's got a new book coming out imminently, by the way, on testing for iOS. I think it's out next month, so check out his stuff. And his site's amazing. Nice. I haven't seen him do a talk, though. He did one in TriSwift Tokyo, and he does workshops normally.
He normally does workshops. I think he was supposed to be doing one in Amsterdam. I don't know if that actually happened, but it's definitely, that's very nice that people thought of me. I'm very, very flattered. But it's definitely something where, I feel like my approach to testing is very pragmatic. And I think that's something that people have connected with, because I think there's a lot of people who just have a really hard time figuring out where to start with testing.
Right.
Because it's just, when you start digging into it and you start seeing, okay, like you need to do everything as TDD, or you need to do this, all of this. And it's just like, man, like, crawl before you walk before you run, run before you fly. It's definitely one of those things where, one of the things that I have always been really interested in is actually UI testing, because one of the things that I've seen is no matter what the state of your code base is, you can always test the UI and make sure it's doing what the app needs to do for customers. Are the people that are actually using your application going to be able to use it the way that they want to? And that's something that you can test no matter like what pit of snakes is in your code base. And, one of the things, so I did a talk in 2016 at UIConf, where I called it Outside In, because the movie Inside Out had just come out. It's sort of the idea of putting like a scaffolding of UI tests up around your application, so that you sort of preserve the facade. if you've ever been in like an older European city, even in Chicago sometimes, they'll like have like an Art Deco building or something, and they'll put all the scaffolding up around the very like historic facade, and then they'll go in the back where it's just like brick that's been falling apart for 50 years, and they'll just completely destroy the whole thing. But they'll have that scaffolding up in order to hold up the part that everybody else sees. And you can't see all the stuff that's happening in the background to like make the building stronger and not collapse. And what UI tests do is provide that same scaffolding. Like you can work, once you have this assurance that like, okay, is this still going to work for the people who need it to work? Then you can start just hammering stuff out in the back and making things better with this sort of safety net of, does this still actually work for users?
Yes.
And, I think that was definitely a technique that I used when I was, it's also something that's nice in terms of if you're new to an app, it's a good way to familiarize yourself with what the app actually does. There's always sort of, what is the app supposed to do versus what does the app do? Because there's always, there's either bugs or there's just features that never got documented, or, like I've definitely come into a situation where I'm like, okay, well, so is there any documentation of like what our feature set is? And they're like, it's the app. And I'm like, that's not ideal. But this is the other thing that you do when you add some of those UI tests is you sort of inadvertently add some documentation of what is it even supposed to be doing.
Okay, so we have UI testing here, and that's for many people that's quite a finished product test. You don't necessarily start with UI tests for a lot of people because it can be a little bit flaky. It can be sometimes hard to write, and often a more achievable goal is to start with a sort of simpler unit tests. Value in, value out. Does that going to work the way you expected? And actually, Philip Lazov has a question here saying, how do you balance UI testing breadth versus execution time? Because these XE UI tests can take a long time to run. It's true. Whereas unit tests should be, in theory, lightning fast.
Yes. So I think one good way to think about it is sort of, at what point of building are you coming in? If you don't have a facade to test to begin with, then you should be testing from the ground up. Then you should be following sort of that testing pyramid that's talking about like unit tests, integration tests, UI tests, sort of each one that's simpler you do more of, and each one that's more complex you do less of. That strategy of putting a scaffolding up on a facade only works if the facade already exists. So it's more, if you're really sort of looking to get started with something and you have a application where you have a pretty good understanding of the code base, you feel like the code base is like reasonably well architected. Testing the ins and outs of something simple is a good place to start, where it's just like, okay, when I put this in, does the amount that I want come out? And it sounds like that's really dumb, but one of the key things about unit testing is being able to catch regressions. Basically being able to say, hey, this used to output 42 and now it outputs 41. Why is that? And being able to see that as soon as you have broken it is really, really helpful. And this is something where when people talk about like the time to invest in testing, this is where you sort of think about, okay, like if I'm writing code and then 3 months later somebody finds a bug in it, I have to then get back into the mentality that I was in when I was first writing that code 3 months ago. I've probably forgotten tons of context, and it's going to take me considerably longer to fix that bug than it would if I had a test that caught that bug immediately, and I would go, oh, I changed this thing over here, and then this started failing, and oh, those things are related in a way that I did not realize.
Right.
And, that still having that context makes that bug fix a lot faster.
Right.
And I think it's something that a lot of places super underestimate when they're sort of budgeting how much time should be allotted for tests, because it's definitely something where it's a little bit of eating your vegetables. It's a little bit of like, hey, you do this thing now, you're going to have a lot less trouble later.
Well, that's a great John Reed quote, is that tests give us the confidence to make bold changes to our code. Because you can
for sure
rip and replace stuff if you want to, and as long as it's green before and green after, it's safe.
Yeah, for sure. And that's definitely, when you have a really good test suite, the ability to just sort of say, all right, just everything out the window and let's try this again. And does it still put out the same output? That's really helpful.
Yeah.
And I think for me, that's where if you're coming into a new code base that's already existing, I think one of the places that I think a lot of advice on testing falls down a little bit is that people are assuming that you're building something new. And personally, I don't usually come into projects that are new. I come into projects that have been built with varying levels of care. And, it's something where the question of how do I test this? How do I get this to a point that I want this to be, especially if it has no tests at all? You have to start from someplace known. And, there's definitely some tricks you can use. There's a great, Peter Steinberger has a great article about testing with KIF at ludicrous speed. And this works for XCUI too as well.
Great article, isn't it? It's a wonderful article.
Yeah. But ultimately what it comes down to is if you set the speed on your, I think it's the animation speed or something.
And the layer speed
on
too,
your main window.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you set that to 100, everything runs 100 times as fast, and it's amazing. It's definitely something where that can shave a considerable amount of time off of a large UI test suite. And, also it's super fun to watch your computer just like, and just look like it's absolutely on crack. But it's definitely something where, I think if you're starting from scratch, start with the test pyramid, and that's also true for adding a new feature to an existing code base. Start by testing, the smallest pieces of logic you have, then make sure those pieces of logic work together, then make sure that it shows up on screen the way that you want it to.
Yeah.
Because, each layer of those tests, as you go up that pyramid, the amount of time that it takes to write, the amount of time that it takes to run, all of that goes up. The more stuff that you can test without having to put anything on the screen, the better. But I think it is something where a lot of advice about testing starts from scratch and not from, hey, I got this giant nest of vipers from the previous developer who was abducted by aliens. I think my favorite one was I had colleagues who got a code base who they determined that the reason that they got the code base was because the previous developer was in jail for selling methamphetamines. And it's just like, yeah.
So you've mentioned a few times the problems with...
That's not ideal.
You've mentioned a few times the problems with starting from scratch. When someone comes into a code, i.e. a new project or one that's existed for a while, that has no tests. It's got the one test that Xcode generates for you, test example, right?
The automatic.
Yeah, that one. And it's an example of how you ought to write tests, and then just don't write tests. Where do you go from there? What advice do you have for folks who have that situation? Where do you start?
My policy on testing is start with the stuff that people are going to come after you with torches and pitchforks for if it doesn't work. You have to look at sort of like what are the most mission critical pieces of this application. If it's like, if you're using an e-commerce application, if you go and you have everything working and then when you go to hit buy, nothing happens, like that's a huge problem. Like that is something where it's like that will tank your business, because if everything else works fine and then you can't actually purchase anything, you don't get any money, and then your business goes bankrupt. And so that's something where, when I say people will come after you with torches and pitchforks, I don't necessarily just mean your users. I also mean your managers. When I was working on, I had a side project called Hum for several years, and during one of our earliest releases, I messed up a core data migration, And so the application was just absolutely crashing on launch during that migration. And people got very angry about it because they were putting, their notes for their songs and their recordings in there. And once that happened, I wrote a test for migrating every single version of the database to a new version, just to make sure, like, okay, let's try make sure that this sort of automatic migration is actually automatic. And that gave me a much more confidence that, at least for that one particular thing, I was not going to screw that up again.
Right.
And it's definitely something where, again, that things where if it doesn't work, your users or your managers are going to come after you. Things you broke before is another good place to start. And just stuff where you look at it and you feel like it's super unstable. You feel like, I don't really know how this works. This is another place where you can sort of start from the outside and start working inwards, where maybe you write an integration test for something where you don't necessarily understand the whole thing, but you know what you're supposed to put in and you know what you're supposed to get out.
Right.
And so you can at least write an integration test for that, and then you can sort of get into that GUI middle part and go, okay, what is going on here? And be able to refactor with the confidence to say, okay, now I have all these unit tests that are able to test each little piece of this whole puzzle. Are all of those passing? And is that integration test that I wrote earlier passing?
Okay. So you mentioned, I mean, there's quite a lot in that one thing you've just said there. And one of the things you've picked up on is that, just getting somewhere, getting some confidence in yourself that this is actually working correctly as you intended. Something's gone wrong in the past, a bug happened, maybe you fixed the bug, hopefully. That's a good starting point to write a test, presumably, because then you can say, it happened before, it broke before, but now I have the confidence that it is fixed. It is better, it's an improvement. There might be 1,000 other bugs, but you still know that bug's fixed and tested, and you've chipped away slowly at the testing code base.
Yeah. I think that's a really, really great place. And I think, one thing that I think a lot of people get stuck on is, like, once they start, they want to be like, okay, I want to have 100% test coverage everywhere. And, it's something where there's the old phrase, never let the perfect be the enemy of the good. It's something where if you had 0% test coverage and now you have 10% test coverage, that's way better. It's something where you have made a huge start. You have made a huge improvement. And the more that you can improve, the better. But don't just spend every waking second trying to improve your test coverage number. And also personally, I find that percentages are not really a very useful metric.
No, particularly that one. Test coverage is almost meaningless. It's nice to have, better than nothing, but you can totally scam it,
Oh, absolutely. I think my favorite example of this was I once inherited a code base where there was a test that literally had a comment that said, "This branch does nothing. It's just here to improve the code coverage for this."
Why?
I deleted that test immediately. I was just like, and this was a code base where there was something in the README that was like, code coverage must be over 95%. And it was like, okay, well then I guess we have to hit this branch that only gets hit during debug and validate that it only gets hit during debug. And it's just sort of, I get very frustrated with that stuff. People who are like, well, I have to test every single guard statement returns when something's not correct. And it's just like,
exactly.
No, you don't. That's why the guard statements are there.
So you've got a test there to say, try and dequeue this thing from a table cell or a storyboard. And that should never fail. If it can't find this thing in the table cell, you've got really big problems, right? It's not you can't fix that at runtime. It's just fundamentally broken, and that's what guard's doing. That's what your return's doing. Get out of there.
Yeah, and I think that's something where I really prefer to take stuff like that, pull it out into an extension, throw a fatal error in the extension if it doesn't work, and then just sort of basically be like, okay, like if this didn't work, that's going to be an immediate crash, because if it crashes loudly and immediately, you are much more likely to find the problem than if you just guard and bail out and then stuff doesn't work.
So speaking of fatal error, Philip Lazov asked the question, can you test a fatal error? I never found how.
That's a good question. No, you can't. So, and that's sort of the if you want to have something that you can test, you have to make it throw. And so that's why I think in general, particularly in SDKs, you don't want to use a fatal error, just because usually somebody else calling into your code wants to do something other than crash. And having something that you can test, you need to be able to test not only is it having an error, is it the error that you expect it to be? And so that's something where using something that throws is much better, and that's what you can test. I generally reserve, when I'm working on an app directly, I reserve fatal error for stuff where it's just like, there is absolutely no reason this should fail unless I have made a typo or just something really, 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 really weird has happened. Stuff like, loading a screen from a storyboard or something like that. Stuff exactly. Like, stuff like trying to load an image from the asset catalog. Like, if I'm trying to load an image that doesn't exist out of the asset catalog, I would really like to know about that at the time I try to load it, so that I'm like, oh wait, I was supposed to do this. Oops. So, I think that to me is where fatal error comes in a lot more handy. Is just places where there is absolutely no way that this should be happening.
Well, to be fair, Swift's trying to be safe, isn't it? Swift's trying to say, listen, making an NS regular expression can throw. But if you've hand-typed that regular expression, it's either right or it's wrong. And if it's wrong, you don't want to find out at runtime on the user's device. You want to find out now, crash loudly, scream at me, get it wrong,
Yeah, and there are some people who are perfectly fine with not finding that out at runtime, but I think, I think those are the type of things, like basically places where if I make a typo, or if like the name of a class changes or something, and then like things don't change appropriately, I want to find out about that as early as possible in the development process. And having a fatal error, like, when you hit a fatal error when you're testing, it crashes the entire test suite. It doesn't just like keep going. And that's something that is, it's also the same if you have a force unwrap. If you hit a force unwrap in your test suite and it ain't there, like, nope, your whole test suite crashes. It doesn't just fail the test. And so that's why XCT unwrap is now a thing. That shortened up a bunch of the work around that, but it's definitely something where it's like, yeah, like if the absence of something is such a huge problem that you need to know about it immediately, then you can probably wrap it in a fatal error. If it's something where it's like there's a reasonable possibility that this could not be there, that's when throws is probably your better choice, because then you can check that when whatever it is isn't doing what you need it to do, that it's handling it appropriately and giving the appropriate error.
I think Apple does have internally tools in place for doing this slightly nicer. Because I don't remember her name, but her handle's like Milanomi. It's like Lady of Infinite Dawns or something. Is her.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh God, why can't I remember her? Yeah.
But I saw her commit a change to Foundation.
Lily Volcano.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
But I saw her commit a change to XCTest in their own internal code. And it basically sets a Foundation flag before it runs anything and then carries on, like in the environment, which system then catches and turns the crash into this test failed. So they have interesting workarounds that have yet to be exposed to us for handling testing a fatal error. This thing will crash, and that's okay. It was supposed to crash for some whatever bizarre reason. So we have a question here from Renato Silva, who's asking, so tests are supposed to be updated in tandem with app development? Question mark. This could mean a lot of work while developing and refining the app's features, right? So the question is, do you do it as you go, write test, write code, not necessarily TDD, but at least in tandem? Or do you just go, bang, here's all my code, and now to prove it is that's what I think it's going to do, bang, here's all my tests?
I tend to sort of, if there's going to be a single commit, if there's going to be a single PR, I want to test everything that's going to be in that PR at the time I'm making that PR. Again, the biggest reason for me to do that is context. Like, if you lose the context that you had when you're writing it, writing those tests is going to take you a lot longer. Right. And that's, I think it's something where sort of understanding, like, okay, what is this supposed to do? And being able to sort of have a test for that at the time that you're putting it into the code. Like, you don't have to do the thing of, like, first I write a test and then I write the code and then I pass the test. Like the very strict TDE, because personally that drives me bananas because I don't have that linear of a thinking process. But, the idea of, okay, I want to submit this to my code base. I need to make sure that I have validated that what I'm doing works. I need to also provide a safety net for when I'm changing things in the future. And that's generally when I write tests, because it gives me the advantage of, having that backup and then also still having the context when I'm trying to figure out whether it's doing what I want it to or not.
Okay, so to be clear for Renato and other listeners, you work into sort of discrete chunks, work packages, perhaps as part of a Scrum sprint or something, and inside
Paul, I lost your audio.
Oh dear. Hello? Oh dear. Can anyone else hear me?
Nope. All right. Can people on the stream hear him?
We hear you, says Pastor. So they hear me just fine.
Oh, now I hear you.
They hear me. Oh, you weren't missing much. Just me wittering on. So I was saying, so to be clear for... I did
enjoy the very wild hand gestures. That was very fun.
I'm good at hand gestures. So to be clear for Renato and other listeners, what you're saying is you work in discrete packages. You'll say, for this sprint, whatever you work with, your work package you're dealing with, you want to do that job, but also write the tests for that. Maybe together, maybe afterwards, but in a single package will include the tests and the production code for that work.
Ideally, yeah. Obviously that's not always possible, but I do, again, for me, the biggest thing is writing the test when you still have the context is really, really, really important because, and particularly for me, I have a garbage memory. I really, one of the reasons, it was funny, one of the reasons I got my first job is they were like, you really commented your code like very thoroughly. And I was like, yeah, because I don't remember anything. Well, I didn't say that out loud, but that's basically, the thing is that, like, this is sort of where my garbage memory actually comes in handy, is that, like, by writing these tests, by having good comments, I'm able to say, okay, this is what I was trying to do here.
Right.
And, be able to sort of have one more thing to jog my memory in terms of what was happening when I wrote this code.
So your tests act as documentation is what you're saying. Your tests act as documentation for what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, I have definitely found that, and it's definitely something where obviously it's not a substitute for documentation. Like, please, for the love of God, document your code. But it is something where it provides additional context to that documentation, and it's also something where I think one of the things that I've long said is that documentation should be the why, not the what. It shouldn't just be like, here's a line that's 2 times 3. It's like multiplies 2 times 3. And that should be like, we need 6 here because blah, 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 or something like that. It's something where, that kind of documentation is so much more useful than just like putting a label on stuff. But it is something where you still need that information about, sort of what it's doing in like a public API or something like that.
Okay.
Where it's like, okay, this is expected to be called from other places. Those other places should know what they're supposed to do with this.
Okay. And how do you make sure your code is testable? Because a lot of folks use things like dependency injection for making sure they can mock things out very easily. Is that what you also rely on, or do you have other techniques you fall back on?
There's definitely some dependency injection. I prefer calling it parameterization because dependency injection sounds terrifying.
Really big.
Yeah, it sounds like really like giant needle coming at me from wherever. No. That sounds terrifying. It also sounds a lot harder than it actually is. Like the main thing that dependency injection involves is saying, okay, instead of using this thing here, I want you to use this fake one. And one way that you could do this, particularly in Swift, is in the initializer or something, you just add a parameter where you say, okay, give me something that conforms to this protocol. And you can give it a default value in Swift so that it uses the real thing 99% of the time, but then when you test it, you can hand it a fake thing. And that, I feel like calling it parameterization is just, it makes it seem a lot more accessible because it really just, it puts a note on this is what you're doing. You're just turning this, instead of having it be a property, you're having it be a parameter. And you can use it to set things up, either for production or for testing. And at that point, then it makes testing stuff a lot easier. It's definitely, I think another thing that I have found to be helpful is just sort of, I don't want to sort of give any kind of guideline in terms of how long should a method be. I know that there's some stuff in SwiftLint where it yells at you if you have more than 50 lines of code in one method or something like that. But I think the thing that I found is just sort of look at how many different things is this particular method doing, and sort of how many of them are conceptually different versus how many of them are sort of conceptually the same thing. So for example, there's something where I am getting the SHA-256 hash of a file. There's a bunch of it where it's just okay, load file, do this, do that. But, ultimately the unit of what I'm doing is, here's a file, give me the SHA-256 hash. Most of the stuff that can fail in that is really complicated C stuff that's really kind of a pain in the butt. And ultimately, if I broke that out into smaller pieces, it would just make the calls much more complicated. But it's something where you sort of have to, and sometimes, honestly, some of getting to where do you break this out versus where do you leave it as one piece, some of that is just practice.
There's a great question here from my friend, actually, Adi Adigoku, who says, it might have been asked before, but as a beginner, what are the things that must be tested? When you're looking at all this, long methods and so forth, thinking which bits of this do I really have to test? And my fallback is normally, only test the bits of code you don't want to crash. But if you're sitting there and your manager's saying you've got to ship this thing now, or you got a limited time frame, a week, 2 weeks, whatever it is to do your testing, if you had to choose, what would you say the priority points are?
Yeah, I go to what is the biggest problem if it breaks? What are some of the pieces that are holding the whole thing together? Test those, because and by testing those, you may reveal other pieces that you did not realize were part of the thing that holds everything together, and then you should also test those. But it's one of those things where it's just if you accidentally pluralize the end of somebody's name wrong, that's not going to break your application. It's a little embarrassing, but it's not the end of the world. If you have something where if somebody tries to, input SQLite commands, it accidentally dumps your whole database. That's something that you should probably be aware of. It's I don't know that you need to necessarily test that just because Apple does a fair amount of sanitization and stuff like that. But there's not really, there's not really a whole lot that can necessarily be sort of immediately identified outside of the context of what your app is, because the context of what your app is really, really important to what do I test. Because if, again, it's like, what are the pieces that are business critical, that are mission critical, that if it breaks, people are coming after you? Those are the things to start with. I think the other thing is just stuff where you're like, I'm not entirely sure how or why this works. That's a good thing to test for. You know, it's there. I've definitely had the sort of like the second worst thing in programming is this doesn't work. I don't know why. The worst thing is this works. I don't know why.
Yeah.
And you know, it's definitely something where if you have code where you're like, this works and I have no idea why, write a test for it so that if something changes and then it stops working, you can at least sort of maybe start to figure out what happened. And that's definitely something where that's a place where I would start. You know, I think you can do that with fairly small units of code pretty easily, but it's definitely something where honestly a lot of it just takes practice, which is a little bit of a crappy answer because it's like, where do I start? Practice, practice, practice. But it's definitely something where, you know, again, the more you do it, the more you'll get a sense of what's worth it and what's not.
Okay. We've got a question here from Jordan Jones. This is really the other side of the equation. Question is, do you have any tips for swaying a client away from 100% test coverage? So if a client comes in, and many clients come in saying, you know, we don't want tests, just write the code. And you're like, oh, no. But some will come in saying, we want 100% test coverage. Do you have any tips of saying, listen, it's just not worth it? Swaying them away from that if possible.
I generally use the story about the thing where somebody was like hitting a useless thing just to have their coverage up. But I think, you know, one thing that's really helpful in Xcode is that you can show code coverage, and you can show that a file that's not 100% covered actually, like, you know, the pieces that aren't covered are not necessarily pieces that need to be covered. These are emergency guard bailouts. These are things where you can sort of see, hey, if something's gotten to this phase, things are really messed up. And so you would need to just bail out of it. But you don't necessarily need to test that has happened, because writing that test takes away time from are we doing more tests on the mission critical part of the application. You know, I think another thing I tell people is like 100% test coverage doesn't mean it's never going to not work. It doesn't mean it's never going to not crash. Like, you can have tested every single line of code in your application, but if somebody puts some weird input in there that you weren't really prepared for, there's a significant possibility that it might not work. You know, the other thing is, if you test everything once rather than testing some of those mission critical things repeatedly, you have this sort of false sense of assurance that, oh yeah, I've tested everything. Whereas if you really make sure that you've thoroughly tested a lot of the possibilities of how things could go wrong on your mission critical code, that may not necessarily add up to 100% test coverage, but you are way less likely to have problems.
Right. And it's like that old QA joke, you know, a QA engineer walks into a bar, orders one beer, orders 9.99 in beers, orders -1 beer, orders a lizard kind of thing, throwing garbage input, really hard fuzz testing. And the other thing I think is that ultimately it's a number, and it's not even a good number, because all it means is while this test was run, these lines of code were run. They could have been completely unrelated to what you're trying to test, or not even evaluated even slightly. They were just run as part of the test that was being run. So that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't prove your code works in any meaningful way whatsoever. It makes me so angry sometimes that people take this number so seriously, when really it's just a number, a nice number, but still a number.
Yeah, and I think, I think there's definitely, you know, one thing to remember also with Swift is there's a bunch of stuff where the type system handles a bunch of the things that would be requiring more test coverage in other languages. So like in Python, you might have to test like, hey, is this thing that I'm getting back actually a string? And in Swift, if it's not a string, it doesn't compile. So, it's definitely something where that having that context is helpful particularly for non-technical people, where it's just like, understanding that like, okay, like in a Python backend, you might have to test like, is this a string? But in a Swift backend, you don't have to do that because the compiler does that for you at compile time, and it won't do anything at all if it's not doing what it needs to do. So I think those are some strategies I would use around that. Honestly, usually the people that I have to convince are usually not the clients, but usually the managers, because managers love the statistic of 100% test coverage. They think it looks amazing.
Yeah.
And I think it is something where there's plenty of places where they sort of pick an arbitrary number for test coverage and they try to hit it. And I think that having a number is a lot less important than actually taking the time to go through your code every once in a while and look at what isn't tested. Because, some of it's stuff where, hey, maybe you might actually be able to delete it. Some of it's stuff where, okay, yeah, that makes sense to not test. Some of it's like, oh, I should probably test that. But it's something where if you're able to do that regularly, that's going to be much more effective than constantly trying to hit an arbitrary goal of a certain percentage of test coverage. In practice, I've generally found somewhere between 75 and 85% is like the best in terms of balancing what do I need to test realistically versus what do I need to sort of move on with my life from.
Yes.
And, but like that's a very, very wide range. And I think it's something where, that's also inclusive of an application that has UI. There's certain things with UI that are going to be harder to test, especially stuff like animations and drag and drop and stuff like that. Like some of that is a real pain to test. And, I think it's much easier to have even higher test coverage on an SDK that has no UI involvement. But it's also something where that there's not a number that I think is something that people should shoot for all the time. And I think that if people are looking for a number, ask them why they're looking for that number. What is the assurance that they're trying to get from saying that they have 100% test coverage? Is it that it's never going to crash? 100% test coverage doesn't guarantee that. Is it that it's always going to work? 100% test coverage does not guarantee that. And so that's something where finding out the underlying reason why people want something is usually much more helpful.
Yeah, I agree. We've got a question here from Patrick saying, what about the trend in coverage over time? For example, requiring that the coverage doesn't at least significantly decrease over time with each PR you put in there.
I think that's reasonable. I think it is something where looking at like, okay, we already have this much coverage. We don't want it to keep dropping below a certain percentage, I think is reasonable. I think it's also a way of sort of saying, hey, with these changes that you're making, like you've actually added 5,000 lines of code and you've added 0 tests, and these 5,000 lines of code are not actually exercised by anything. That's more of a, hey, like maybe you would like to add some tests to these changes. I think it's something where you do have to have some wiggle room. You can't just have it be like, you must have at least 75% test coverage. But like, it is something where having the tools to identify when somebody is adding code to your repo that isn't tested is actually really helpful.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the functionality we have apart from just XC test, because to back up the way my brain's thinking, does my code work the way I intended? I think of things like assertions or preconditions, as well as fatal error. And you mentioned fatal error already. Are you also using assertions and preconditions?
Less. Usually, if I'm using assertions or preconditions, I'm actually personally, I tend to prefer to do a guard and then do a fatal error within the guard, rather than using assertion or precondition, just because personally I find that leads to me figuring out what the problem is a lot easier. I think that's somewhat more of a personal preference than anything else. I do know, I think it is something where there are things where you might add an assertion failure in so that if it breaks if something happens during development, you find out about it immediately. But if it happens in production, it's not the end of the world. Just sort of bail out and be done with it. That's sort of the use case that I see for assertions and precondition failures. But I think honestly, at this point, most stuff, if it's doing something that would cause an assertion failure, something has gone pretty wrong. And in many cases, it's probably better to have that be a fatal error.
Okay.
But it's also something where the question is, what are the consequences of this not working? Are the consequences of this not working something where, well, this really should work every single time, and if it doesn't, then something is messed up. That should be a fatal error. If it's something where there is a reasonable possibility that this could not work in production, then that's where you use an assertion failure.
Okay. So let's go ahead and park testing. We've gone, I think, a fair amount of detail right there. I want to talk about Swift Package Manager because you actually spoke at my event last year about some of the work you're doing around SPM.
I did.
Because you push SPM hard, right?
I do, yeah. I really enjoy using SPM to make little utilities. So one thing that I've done through Apollo is that we had a lot of stuff that was being done in a bash script. I am really bad at bash, just really horrendously bad at bash, and the documentation is not ideal. And so it's something where I sort of realized, okay, I want to take these other things that I'm working with, and I want to be able to just access them using a language that I already know, a language that I know works on anything that will be used to build iOS tools. And I just want to be able to write Swift run blah and be done with it. And so I've set up a bunch of stuff where people can actually set up our code generation using a Swift library. I had that break in a super fun way when Xcode 11.4 came out, because it used to be that if you called xcrun from any build script run phrase, it would use the Mac OS X version of Swift to do everything. Now you actually have to specify Mac OS X. So you have to do xcrun SDK Mac OS X Swift run in order to ensure that it actually uses the Mac OS X SDK rather.
Now, I should say here, actually, Ankit Agarwal is on the chat, who works in SPM a lot at Apple. So this is your chance to file radars in person. Tell him exactly all your problems. I'm sure he'll get around to fixing them straight away.
Hi, Ankit. I'll send you a link. There's I've got an open PR on Apollo right now that's got that stuff in it. But it's definitely. It was one of those things where I'm like, I'm not sure whether this is actually a bug or whether this fixes a bug. Because generally when you run a build script run phase from Xcode, it does sort of assume that you're using everything in the environment that whatever your project is using. Whereas, and the fact that if you just called xcrun, it would just kick off with Mac OS X, that was different from how anything else would work. But yeah, it's changed. I don't know if that was supposed to change, but it changed.
Well, no soon enough.
So yeah. But yeah, I think it's really, I've really been excited about working with SPM. I think, I have fought endlessly with CocoaPods and Carthage my entire career. Like CocoaPods, when it first came out, was an absolute dream in terms of integrating anything. Like, yeah, there was a bunch of stuff that was really annoying in terms of how it would mess with your Xcode proj file. But at that point, I didn't care because I could actually use dependencies in a way that made sense. I have long been on the record as not being a super fan of Carthage. I might have tweeted a T-shirt that said "Carthage delenda est," which is Latin for "Carthage must be destroyed," which is I'm like, yay, references to first century wars. But it's one of those things where I think Carthage solves the problem wildly differently than CocoaPods does. And I think there are definitely ways and situations in which it works better. In my personal experience, I have had a large number of problems with things just like I changed nothing and it all broke. And that for a package manager is not ideal. No. And so when you sort of have the choice between, okay, we have the CocoaPods ecosystem that's reasonably stable, but does a lot of stuff to like mess around with your project. And then you have the Carthage ecosystem, which doesn't do anything to your project, but also can be kind of fragile. Having player 3 in the room is nice because it does encourage new things. It also is very helpful that, in my opinion, that it's backed by Apple. I think that's been a reason that a lot of people have been a little bit reluctant to sort of jump onto either Carthage or CocoaPods. But I think, I think at a certain point, I think this is kind of part of why the iOS ecosystem has a lot of not invented here syndrome, because adding additional dependencies comes with such a high price. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of people who would argue that that's a good thing. Because you don't want to wind up with the infamous npm left pad thing where like somebody threw a fit, deleted a project, and then broke half the internet. You certainly don't want to end up with that. But I think conversely, you also don't want to end up with a situation where everyone is reinventing the same wheel all the time. And I feel like that's something that we wind up doing a lot in the iOS community. In a way that's super counterproductive. Yeah. And sorry. Yeah.
So what CocoaPods gave us, from nothing effectively, was a platform where we could share code very, very easily and keep it updated with security updates and feature updates and similar. Because before that, there wasn't a lot going on, right? We were just copying in Objective-C, right? At the time, copying in the headers and the M files and so forth. So CocoaPods was a big improvement there. And of course, it did give us a standard. It wasn't a standard that many people liked in some respects because you had to download that very large master repo. And as you say, it modified your project to have a workspace and similar. So it caused a few teething problems, but it became a standard which we could at least work with. Whereas now SPM, because it is backed by Apple, is a fresh standard and a simpler standard, I think.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I'll say is for CocoaPods is it's a lot less complicated than it used to be. There's definitely they've definitely done a lot of work to make it simpler, make it more stable, and make it do less to mess around directly with your Xcode pod or your XC workspace. And so that's something where, like, honestly, if people ask me what to use, I'm like, all right, like, do you have any of these things that are currently like blockers on SPM, like some resources or there's one or two other things that are still outstanding, Swift evolution things to implement. And it's like, if you don't have any of those, use Swift Package Manager because it's a lot easier. If you do have those, try to use CocoaPods. And again, I really appreciate the work that went into Carthage. Like, people really worked their butts off on it, and it's something where I completely see what they were trying to do with it. I just have personally, and I try to emphasize this, personally found that the trade-offs in terms of sort of when it works great. When it doesn't work, it fails in ways that are really difficult to troubleshoot. And that, I think, is the piece that I've had the most problems with.
Right. We got to this point, I think it must have been a year or so ago, maybe slightly longer, where every iOS repo on GitHub would have CocoaPods and Carthage and SPM. And that's like, okay, I think we've lost our direction slightly here. We don't necessarily need 3 different package managers to handle the way we do stuff. It's a bit more like the JavaScript community.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely still supporting all 3. I think it's made me even more Carthago dilettante, but it's definitely, it's definitely one of those things where I think until Swift Package Manager can handle some of the, I don't want to say edge cases, but sort of more common things that SDKs need to do that aren't sort of the basic, here's a bunch of code. I think once that's resolved, I think that PM is definitely going to be the better option, but it's not super clear when some of that stuff is going to land. And I think it's definitely something where, it's just it's a hard problem to solve. I mean, like, God bless Ankit and Boris and everybody else who are working on the Swift Package Manager. Like, you guys are doing God's work, because it is difficult to write a package manager. I think when I was my most recent complaint on Twitter about Carthage, I was saying about CocoaPods that I less frequently wanted to launch it into the sun. And then I said, if I never wanted it to launch it into the sun, it wouldn't be a package manager. And I had a couple of people be like, that's my new bio. And it's like people who worked on CocoaPods and on SPM and Carthage. So, it's a really difficult problem to solve. And I admire anybody with the ability to try and solve it. And I think I'm really glad that Apple has put their resources behind trying to solve this for the Swift ecosystem, because I really do think, like, particularly dealing with like NPM, as much as I loathe JavaScript, using NPM is, once you actually get it to the point where NPM is like updated and doing what you need it to do, which is a whole other thing. But once you get it to that point, then it's much, much easier to use. And I think, particularly working with Android, where both Kotlin and Java use Gradle to manage dependencies, like, the way that we do it in iOS is insane. So I think I'm really looking forward to Swift Package Manager reaching full maturity. I'm just happy that it's baked into Xcode now and that you can use it with iOS projects.
It's so nice. That must be a big boon for you too, because the UI is simple. Go to the package thing in the menu and then add the URL, choose the version you want to work with, and it's there. It's as simple as you can get, really, I hope.
Yeah, well, and I think this is where I go back to the thing that I was talking about earlier about, like, it would be great if Xcode plugins were a thing again, because for most libraries, that's all you have to do. For our library, there's a bunch of stuff that you have to do to set up code generation that is not straightforward, and is something where I have done my darndest to make that as straightforward as possible. But it is really, it's really something where I compare the experience to that of front-end developers who are using NPM and Visual Studio Code, which allows plugins, and the amount of things that you have to do to set up code generation and sort of the ability to use TypeScript code really easily in Visual Studio Code is approximately none. Like, it's basically done for you by the plugin. And on iOS, I have tried to make it as short a thing as possible, and I keep looking for further shortcuts. But ultimately, if I can't have something in the if the IDE itself isn't extensible, there's only so much I can do.
Yes.
So
I have some good news here from
that's
Ankit saying that the SwiftPM team has been working on landing all the current adoption blockers, like resources, like binary dependencies, and so on, and it's already in Swift 5.3, which was like the roadmap. Was that yesterday the roadmap was announced, or today? It was.
Yes, that was yesterday.
Yeah.
Well, it was yesterday the roadmap was announced, and they did say that they were. I was looking at that this morning, and they were like, "So when is this gonna freeze for Swift Package Manager?" It was like, "Oh, that's tomorrow." So I'm very glad to hear that most of that's in Swift 5.3. I wasn't sure how much of that made it in there. Yay! Thanks, Ankit. But yeah, it's really, I really am. I'm really excited about this feature of Swift Package Manager, not just for use with iOS stuff, but I really enjoy using it for scripting. I really enjoy using it for just small tools that, particularly if there's something that you're distributing with your SDK, you're able to write and test them in a way that is just not possible with Bash.
Right.
And it just makes your life an awful lot easier. And so I really, really, really like it.
Yeah. So that's SPM. Let's park that there.
Mm-hmm.
And to wrap up, I want to talk about, if you have the time still, Ellen, thank you so much for your very generous time.
Oh, yeah.
No,
we're good.
Just working from home right now, because we're all doing it, not necessarily by choice. Some folks are doing it for the very first time. They've been used to a team around them doing coding or project management or design around them. And now we're all working through Slack and GitHub and Google Docs or Twitter, and I guess you've been doing it a long time because you're a committed worker from home now. Is that right?
Well, so sort of. Apollo is all remote. So we have a bunch of people in San Francisco, but then the majority of the company, particularly of the engineers, are remote. And obviously, right this second, everyone's remote. But it is something where that was something that helped us as a company deal with this. It is something where one thing that I wound up sharing with my fiance that has been really helpful for us as a company. We sort of have this policy of like have a low barrier to entry of just starting a really quick video chat, because there's so much stuff where you can spend like 20 minutes arguing about it on Slack and then have like a 3-minute video conversation and be done with it.
Right.
And I think, for many of the reasons that video is better than text, like you're able to look at people, you're able to see their body language, you're able to hear their voice, and there's a lot of meaning and context that gets lost when you're just writing things over text. That's really, really hard. And I think I think that's something that, for her, she has a lab that she goes to every day, and her lab, like, they have meetings like several times a week. And so for her, like, it's been like, okay, I want to have this discussion with this other person in my lab, but I don't know if I have time to like bother them. And it's like, no, just drop the barrier to what it takes to have a quick video call, because it will save you so much time in the end.
Well, that's a really big tip for folks who are working from home then, who they're doing it for the first time right now, enforced. And that sounds like a major tip from you is talk, like face-to-face, chat. Actually, don't just type away on Slack, but do something physically face-to-face if you can. But obviously not possible right now, therefore Skype or FaceTime or something else. See them.
Yeah, and that's definitely something that's big. I live in Wisconsin. I think now there's another guy who works for my company in Madison, but until about a week ago, my closest coworker I think lived in like Montreal. So it's it's definitely something where understanding all that stuff, and if everybody's in the same time zone, it makes a bunch of stuff a lot easier, because then you don't have to worry about time zones and stuff, especially right now where it's that fun time between like where the US goes on daylight savings and Europe goes on daylight savings.
Love it.
So all of the times that you think are correct are completely wrong. But yeah, it's definitely one of those things where it just like, being able to sort of still have that face-to-face communication, even if it's over video, is really critical. And I think I have to admit, I'm not good at working from home. I am someone who had just started paying for a co-working space a couple of months ago because I realized that working all by myself at home is maddening. I am a huge extrovert. I need to be around people.
Yeah.
And so it's been really, really, really rough on me going back to being at home all the time. I think my fiance and I have made the best of it in terms of like figuring out our respective work configurations and all that kind of stuff. But, it's definitely something where, I think for me, I'm used to working from anywhere just because I travel so much. And so it's been really excruciating to not only not like be able to go to my co-working space. Like I don't think I have anything on my travel schedule until October, which is really rare for me. And it's just something where, and like, I don't even know if that's going to happen at this point. So it's definitely one of those things where, like if you are a person who thrives off of other people, this is a really rough time. And I like, do not feel alone that you're having a hard time. I think, there's all sorts of tips that people try to give about like, well, have a separate space for your work stuff. And I'm like, I live in a 2-bedroom apartment that's about 800 square feet. Like, having a separate space for my work stuff from my fiance's space for her work stuff, like that basically means I'm working at the dining room table and she's working in the second bedroom. It's something where she uses dictation software all day, so I can't also work in that second room,
right?
Because otherwise I'm listening to her talk all day. And it's one of those things where just I think a lot of the there's some of the advice around like use a separate space that's just like that is awesome advice if you have the space. And I think it's something where that was ultimately why I wound up just cracking and getting a co-working space. And like, I had to like ride my bike or jump on the bus for 15 minutes. And what I really found was that was a really helpful thing for me to go from I am at home mode to I am at work mode. And I know some of my coworkers have sort of hacked this by being like, okay, I'm going to walk around the block as my like commute. And that seems like it's helpful for some people. It was not helpful for me. I need to actually physically go somewhere to feel like I'm commuting.
So there's a question here from Uli Witness.
Yeah.
Do you have any rituals, a cool word, rituals, to help you get into the work from home mindset? Things that you found out to help you with staying undistracted?
Getting a co-working space? This has really been what I've been battling with the last few weeks is just, I gave a shot to working from home when we first moved here. And I sort of very quickly turned into Jack Nicholson from The Shining. I was just like, hey, everybody. But it's definitely something where, the biggest tip is to just try to have some place where you draw the line between working and not working.
Right.
Whether it's just sort of like, okay, at 7 p.m., I'm going to close my computer. And if anybody has problems after that, I'll deal with them tomorrow. If you're in a position to be able to do that, that's really helpful. If you've got some kind of on-call rotation, that's not really doable. But it is something where just being able to say, okay, here is where work starts and here is where work ends. Just having that separation of like, okay, like instead of like, okay, we're going to watch an episode of RuPaul's Drag Race and then go back to working for 3 hours, like that's having that like separation is really critical in my opinion, because otherwise it just feels like work never ends.
Right. You want to say, listen, it's 7 p.m. now. I'm going to sashay away.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it sounds like you were working from home previously and you found it hard because you're an extrovert, you want to talk and mingle with folks. But you're doing that and you're aware of what a regular work from home environment does for you. And now it's an enforced work from home because of the global pandemic taking place right now. And so many folks are doing it for the first time. And they're finding, I think, the extra stress of the world adds to the current work from home stress in the world.
Oh, absolutely.
So it's a particularly hard time to
Yeah.
be sort of trial by fire thrown into the work from home environment. How are you handling that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm handling it at least marginally better because I did try it before, and I'm just like, okay, like I'm gonna really try to have the separation now. But I mean, I have to be honest, like I have not been productive the last couple of weeks. Like it has been all I could do to keep what little of my sanity I still have. And, you know, like just manage to do stuff like go grocery shopping and, you know, just deal with the world as it is. And, you know, it's definitely something. There was a good article that was going around. You know, I think somebody referred to like sort of being constantly hooked on Twitter and like looking at the news as horror scrolling, which I like that phrase because I've been doing a lot of horror scrolling. And, you know, I think one thing that came up when I was reading that is there was an article. I'll try and send out a tweet with it, but it was in Harvard Business Review of all things. But it was talking to an expert on grief, and you know they were sort of talking about like the feeling that you're feeling right now is grief for the way that life was, and it's okay to feel that. It's okay to sort of go through like ye old Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief, like denial, bargaining, anger, depression, and acceptance. Apparently there's a sixth one, which is meaning. But it's definitely one of those things where, you know, I think that gave an interesting frame to the way that I've been feeling lately. And it's just definitely like, you know, everything has been turned upside down. And I think that, like I was saying at the beginning, like, you don't have to be the world's most productive person. You just have to get through. And that's what I'm trying to do at this point. And, you know, I think it's also something where another thing that I saw on Twitter that I thought was helpful was somebody saying, anytime someone is being a complete jerk, I'm just in my mind picturing them saying under their breath, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, I'm so scared. And sort of really sort of get sort of that perspective of like, okay, this person might be being a jerk, but they're probably being a jerk because they're terrified. And, you know, that's something where I think it's worth sort of trying to have compassion for people about all of this stuff. I think is really critical because, and I think that's been something that, honestly, I've seen a lot of people sort of saying, oh yeah, my work still expects me to do everything that I was supposed to do before. And I'm just like, run. You know, it's something where it's hard. And I know you got 2 kids. You must be going up the walls, like trying to keep them, wrangled. But, well, you do have 2 herding dogs, so that helps. But, you know, it's definitely something where, you know, hopefully this won't last super long. It does seem like in the US it's going to be a while because we are going into what appears to be a really bad phase of this. But it is something where I think it's important to remember that this isn't forever. And I think that, you know, I sort of said to my fiance the other day, I said, I hope one day soon this will all just be a memory. And she's like, I don't think it's going to be anytime soon. And I'm like, well, I didn't mean like next week. I meant more like December. You know, and in the great scheme of things, yeah, like the last 3 weeks have felt like about 5 years. But so the idea of looking at December is like, oh my God, that's so far away. In the great scheme of things, no, it's not.
I was trying to tell my kids that, you know, my youngest is 6 years old, and she probably doesn't really remember much, I expect, from the first few years of her life. You know, years 1 through 3, for example, are pretty vague for her, but 4, 5, and 6 she remembers pretty clearly. So as far as she's concerned, 1/3 of her life has a global pandemic. Like, and I'm trying to say, listen, this is not normal. This is really not normal. When you grow up and have kids of your own, and you say, listen, I was off school for 5 months. They'll think you were like some country bumpkin, school. We don't have school where I was young, It's unimaginable what's happening right now, and it's almost their normal. And we keep on saying this is not normal. It's really not normal. We're all figuring this out as we go along. Anyway, I've got a few quick final questions here, and we'll get them as fast as we can, and then we'll wrap up. One here again from Ade, who asks, in terms of the development or progress of a junior developer, should they work remotely or not? What do you think?
That's a good question. I think that if you are at a company that is all remote, that's a good place to be a junior developer, because being a junior developer and being remote, those can both be things that are harder. But if you have everyone in the same boat, then it becomes much easier to sort of understand what it takes to mentor junior developers remotely. It's something where, I personally did not go remote until more recently. But that's, I think a big piece of the reason that I'm remote is just circumstantial. Like, I looked for a job that I could do anywhere in the US, and I got one. Yay. And, it happened to be not in the city that my company had offices. Like, if I lived in San Francisco, I'd have been going into the office every day, rather than renting a co-working space. But it's something where I don't live in San Francisco. So it is something where, you have to, if you're the only person who's remote and you're junior, that can be really hard, because one of the things that's helpful about being in a physical space when you're a junior developer is you get to overhear a lot of things. You get to, go and ask people stuff on a regular basis in a way that feels less interruptive than just slacking somebody at random. But if you're at an all remote company, everybody's in the same boat. And I think that's something that's worth thinking about.
Okay. We have a question here from Us Ireland saying, do you have any suggestions for people trying to get their first iOS dev job, particularly in relation to portfolio projects and testing, or suggestions for content?
Yeah, so I think it's really hard when you're, it's always that catch-22 when you're trying to get your first job of, like, nobody wants to hire you if you have no experience, but if you have no experience, you can't get hired. Or you can't get experience without getting hired. I think one thing that I would sort of say is, I know that I've always been impressed with people who can have something on GitHub where they can sort of talk through, here are the decisions that I made, here are sort of some of the things that maybe I would have done differently if I had to do this again. I think it is always impressive to have some stuff in the App Store. I think the bar for that is lower than it used to be, given all of the improvements to code signing and how much less like, you still have to bang your head on your desk a lot to make it work, but it's a lot less than it used to be. So it's definitely something where it is a little bit less of a thing to just sort of have something random on the App Store. But I think it's also something where having something where you can talk through, here's the problem that I identified, here's how I tried to solve it. Here's some thoughts about the architecture of the application. Here's some thoughts about, what are some additional features I might want to do. Here's how I've tested it. Like, having the ability to talk through and describe that stuff is really great. And honestly, a really good way to practice that is to write it up in a README.
Okay, a nice easy one to finish up on from Yix. Ellen, what are you excited about for this year's Dub? Christmas time.
Ooh. I would love to, I have to admit that I would love to see Combine go open source. I don't know that that's going to happen. I'm really excited to see the second version of SwiftUI. I have to admit I haven't gotten as much time to play around with it as I would like to, because I've mostly been working on sort of under the hood stuff with Apollo. But I think it's been really, really exciting to see how much easier it has the potential to make building and iterating on screens for a lot of people. And I think, I'm really excited to see what people are coming up with. And honestly, like, I think this year I would just be really happy if we could have sort of a, everybody sort of jokes about we want a snow leopard release of like just fix everything.
Slowly,
like take all the stuff that like take all the stuff that's been happening and fix it. But I will admit, like, the one thing that will get me to like jump off my couch and go is real plugins for Xcode. Like that would, I don't think it's going to happen, but prove me wrong, Apple.
I thought last year would be the year. I thought that they're finally seeing sense. We're arguing so much about this, and I still think this year is going to be the year. I'm an eternal optimist. I'm convinced this year we're finally going to see Xcode with real extensions or plugins in there to do the old sort of Alcatraz style stuff.
That would be really nice, and I think it is something where I think as people who are using Swift use Visual Studio more for server-side stuff, people are really starting to see like, oh, having a real plugin architecture for your IDE is like super helpful. So it would be really nice if that happened. I am certainly not putting any money on it, but it would be really, really nice. It's definitely something that would be helpful. My pie in the sky wish is some version of XCUI testing that doesn't run in a separate process. That's one thing that drives me absolutely bananas about XCUI is that you can't really make any changes to your application under test. Like you can't mock out what the date is. You can't, you can't say, okay, I want to pretend that it's, I used to work for a parking app and, we needed to test, hey, if I make a reservation from December 31st of one year to January 1st of the next year, that actually works. And you couldn't do that except on December 31st without doing a whole bunch of weird workarounds with XCUI. Whereas there are other UI testing frameworks like TIFF that run in process and are able to take advantage of mocking and things like that and dependency injection in ways that is really a lot harder to do with XCUI, at least in a way that doesn't involve putting test code in your production application, which I really am not a huge fan of.
Okay. Well, Ellen, thank you so much for your time. Where can folks find you on the web?
So I am always on Twitter at designated nerd. You can find me there. You can find me working on the Apollo GraphQL iOS repo. So that's github.com/ApolloGraphQL/Apollo-iOS. And then, let's see. If you want to see a whole lot of cat pictures, you can go to Instagram.com/loudguitars. Those are basically the places to follow me online. I basically never shut up on Twitter, so that's a good place to find me usually.
Okay, and folks, if you enjoy this video, you should hit like because it helps YouTube recommend it to other folks. And of course, subscribe to the channel. There are more of these coming. The next one is Saturday. I'm speaking with John Sundell, I think in the afternoon, about the same sort of time, but you'll see more on Twitter about the exact timings of that. But subscribe, like the channel, like the video, all that nice YouTube stuff. And I will see you in the next episode. Again, thanks, Ellen. Take care, folks.
Bye.